Hello and welcome to Chapter 14. As we discussed in class, this chapter will not be covered in the classroom, so please be sure you watch this video, read the chapter really carefully, and there are a number of slides that have some pretty detailed information that you'll be wanting to study for the final exam. We'll be discussing regulations and ethical concerns as they relate to integrated marketing communication and other aspects of marketing. So first of all, we've discussed briefly, but there are a lot of different ethical issues in marketing. In fact, a lot of people think all marketing is bad, which I certainly don't believe, but marketing can be used for good or evil. There's issues regarding brand infringement, like trying to make your brand look like somebody else's brand or trying to rip off their brand or brand name, their look. Professional services marketing have some issues related to ethics in terms of trying to sell people legal or medical services that maybe they don't really need or that could be unethical in some way. Receiving gifts or getting bribed can happen in marketing and marketing communication, and you have to determine what your ethical stance is and what your company's ethical stance is regarding those types of things. Spam, cookies, violation of privacy, especially when it relates to the internet, and even more so when it relates to children, are all things that can come up as related to ethics in marketing. Ambush marketing, remember, that's when you kind of pretend that you're the sponsor of an event when you really aren't. Maybe implying that you're a sponsor of the Olympics when you really aren't, even if you're not using the term Olympics, but you're trying to kind of convince people that maybe you're one of the supporters of the Olympics when you haven't paid for that. Stealth marketing, remember, is when we try to market our products without revealing that we're marketing people or brand ambassadors. Marketing to children have some specific ethical considerations as well as legal considerations. Pharmaceutical marketing, as I mentioned before, some countries don't even allow marketing prescription drugs directly to consumers. In this country we do, but there are certainly ethical considerations related to that. Advertising, some people believe, promotes overspending. Try to convince people to buy things that they really can't afford, and related to that is often finance options. So instead of saying, hey, this is a $50,000 car and you only make $25,000 a year, but we say, hey, we can sell this to you for $500 a month for the next, 7, 8, or 9 years. It used to be that financing in the car world was limited to 3 or at the most 5 years, and now we're seeing leases from, loan agreements that are much longer than that. So ethical issues, of course, regarding that. And marketing to vulnerable consumers like senior citizens or veterans sometimes, or people who have maybe medical issues. Those are all things that can have related ethical issues. So we discussed briefly, but brand infringement, for example, here we see the Benadryl package, and CVS and Walgreens are both trying to mimic. In fact, Walgreens even uses Waldrill. They're using part of the name of Benadryl. So this is potentially even would have legal implications, but certainly has ethical implications, implying to a consumer that, hey, we're this product, and are we stealing some of this brand equity? Are we misleading consumers? Are we taking advantage of the company that makes Benadryl? On the other hand, as I mentioned, Benadryl probably wouldn't sue these companies because they depend on them as retailers for their products. So, but there certainly are ethical issues whether or not there are legal in that case. Ambush marketing, again, pretending that you're sponsoring something that you really aren't, associating your brand with something that other brands may have paid for, but you haven't. I mentioned that we did do this sometimes with different brands that I've worked with in the past, maybe distribute samples across the street from an event or something like that. Probably not illegal. We would always stop if someone asked us to stop, but is that ethical? Something you can ask yourself. In terms of stealth marketing, again, pretending that you're just enjoying the brand even though you're being paid to be a brand ambassador. We discussed examples of that in our alternative marketing regarding a Jim Beam example and a Sony Ericsson example where they were showing cameras pretending to be tourists when they were really brand ambassadors. And advertising to children, a lot of different issues related to this, both on the ethical side as well as on the legal side. On the ethical side, it's thinking about what is ethical to advertise to children. Should we be advertising to the parents versus the children under a certain age? Should we be advertising things that are unhealthy for them or potentially even dangerous for them? You have to decide what the rules should be for yourself personally in terms of what you think is okay. But your company and your brand should also have ethical standards set up so that you understand what is okay on an ethical side. On a legal side, you have to comply with the laws, and we'll discuss those laws a little bit later. Fair trade and living wages. This is something that comes up quite a bit, and a lot of companies use this actually as a marketing selling point for their brands, and in some cases as a differentiator. Fair trade is basically that they're buying products in a way that's sustainable environmentally, and that they're giving good working conditions and fair pay to the people who are working to make the products that they're sourcing from other countries or even from locations within the United States, within their home country. Of course, in the U.S., some people think we don't even pay fair wages here. A living wage is basically the idea that a parent would be able to support a family with the wages that they make from a single job that is 40 hours a week. And if they can't do that, then technically that's not a living wage. So again, there are both ethical and marketing considerations in terms of these topics. And you can look for more information, look at, for example, what Starbucks does to supposedly have fair trade coffee as part of their product lineup. So a lot of companies have their own code of ethics and ethics training programs to ensure that the people who work for their company understand what are the rules and what do they expect the standards to be. If you work for a company, you should understand what their ethical standards are, what their ethics code is, maybe even get involved in helping to write it. Often ethics codes are updated on a periodic basis. Also, you can always have higher ethical standards than your company, provided that it won't get you fired, but you can even decide to leave if you feel they're asking you to do something that you don't want to do. For example, when I worked at a promotions agency, I told them that I did not want to work for any of our cigarette clients. On the other hand, I didn't mind working for alcohol clients, so I had different standards. Some people didn't want to work on the alcohol accounts either. So these are things to consider, but a lot of companies, they really should, especially the larger companies, always have an ethical code of conduct, and you should be aware of what those are. A good ethical code of conduct should deal with promoting trustworthiness, respect, responsibility of its employees, and corporate responsibility to the community, being fair, caring about the community and its workers, being good citizens of the country, of the world, and of the local community. It won't resolve every issue, but you can try to anticipate issues that would happen within your industry. For example, in the alcohol industry, we knew we had a lot of promotions people in bars, and they might be drinking, and they might be supervising people of the opposite sex, and there might be interactions that could have issues both on the ethical or legal side. And so we made sure that everybody knew what the standards were. And for example, when it came to driving after drinking, while it might be legal to drive after drinking one drink or even two drinks, depending on your weight, we said that absolutely no driving if you've been drinking. And we would pay for taxi cabs, no questions asked, for anybody who wanted to, who was in a situation where they needed to get home after having had a drink or two. And that certainly was important for a company like Jim Beam. We didn't want to have it in the press, but also we cared about the people, and we felt that that was the right thing to do. I have a very quick and easy ethics test. I basically ask myself, hey, if my grandma knew I did this, would she be disappointed in me, right? And so there's probably somebody in your life. My grandma Verda is the person who I feel is maybe the most ethical person in my life, and so I kind of feel she has the higher standard than I would. So I ask myself, you know, what would she think? But you probably have someone in your life who you feel that way about as well. And I feel that a lot of times that can really help you to set standards for yourself personally. So think about that. Now on the legal side, we talked about ethics up until now, but on the legal side, there are a lot of things to consider as well. I really want you to know all of these agencies and understand which agencies are government regulatory agencies and which agencies are actually industry agencies that are kind of self-regulatory. So these are all government regulatory agencies. First, we have the Food and Drug Administration, which is in charge of packaging and labeling in terms of how you have to package maybe for safety, like over-the-counter drugs, but also how you have to label things. For example, you have to have the ingredient that has the most quantity in a product first in an ingredients list, and the least quantity in that product is the last in the ingredients list. For calories, there are some very specific ways to measure calories. Usually you're going to need to use an outside agency to do that type of thing, but mostly if you're just working in marketing, communication, and advertising, you won't have to deal with that much. But as a brand manager, you certainly would. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they license all broadcast media, so radio and television, and they also limit advertising to children, but they don't really regulate other advertising content. They don't get involved in that part. The U.S. Postal Service is in charge of mail fraud investigations, so if you do direct mail pieces and things like that, if there's any fraud involved in mail, mail advertising, like direct mail advertising, then they would get involved in that, and they could prosecute you for having false information in something that you mailed to somebody through the U.S. Postal Service. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the BATF, they regulate only those three industries, but they have specific regulations regarding advertising, labeling, and a variety of other things that if you're in any of those industries, you'd have to know those as well. And finally, the Federal Trade Commission, they tend to get into the oversight of marketing and advertising, making sure that there isn't fraudulent advertising, false advertising claims, and things like that. And they get involved in that aspect of the business. Now, you don't need to know exactly this year, that's fine, but basically there was an amendment that happened to give the FTC the authority to investigate and look into unfair and deceptive practices. And they're able to levy fines, to give fines to companies that are deceiving their consumers. Now, this is super important to know because you have to understand what's okay to say and what's not okay to say in an ad. Now, an advertisement or communication is considered deceptive or misleading if a substantial number of people or a typical person is left with a false impression or misrepresentation of what that product can do or what that product is. And also the misrepresentation has to induce people or the typical person to make a purchase. So even if they're deceived, but that's not the reason they bought it, then that's not really considered deceptive or misleading enough to be considered illegal. But if both of these things happen, then you're considered to have violated this law. So if just one person who's maybe not that smart was deceived or pretends to be deceived, that's not enough to file a claim against the company or to get them in trouble with the law. It has to be something that a common person would consider a problem, would believe, and then buy because of it. It is okay, though, to engage in puffery or what we call hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggeration, so is puffery, but it's not a factual statement. So it's not something that you could prove or disprove, like I'm the best looking professor on campus or something like that, right? It's not really a provable thing. It's more qualitative than quantitative, and so that's okay to do. You can say, best, greatest, finest, that type of thing is usually okay. But if you say better, it starts to make a comparison, so you have to be careful about that. And anytime you're making a factual claim, you can't say that was puffery. So if you say we're the world's greatest pizza, might be okay. So here it says this soup's got fewer net carbs than the crackers floating on top. It's making a claim. You'd have to prove that claim. Usually if I were making a claim like that in an ad, I would first send out, I would use an outside laboratory or an outside objective party to provide proof so that if I was questioned about it later, I could show that we didn't just do the testing ourselves, but we had an outside party do it. On the other hand, puffery would be something like Carlsberg, probably the best beer in the world. Well, first of all, they said probably, but even if they said the best beer in the world, it's okay because it's not really a provable claim and people understand, the average consumer understands that this is puffery or hyperbole, so it's perfectly fine. So you do have to substantiate claims if you make factual claims. It should usually be an independent objective testing. If you're using endorsers, they can't be lying. If it's an expert that's endorsing the product, then it definitely needs to be based on factual, legitimate tests. Like if a doctor or a dentist or an engineer was claiming something. So just keep that in mind. The court's going to look at ads pretty broadly, and you have to be able to prove if you're making a factual claim. Generally, the investigation, if somebody's saying that you committed fraud in your ads, sometimes a consumer might complain. Quite often, it's a competitor who complains because, of course, your competitors kind of want to bring you down if they see that you're making a claim, especially if it's comparative against them and it's not true, then they're very often likely to submit a claim. Sometimes congressional representatives might just because they're trying to show their constituents that they're taking care of them and looking out, and it's a good publicity for them sometimes to go after a company that they think is deceiving consumers. And finally, the media, sometimes they'll do investigations and find out that a company is misrepresenting themselves or their products, and they'll go after them that way. So basically the process with the FTC, if somebody thinks or a company thinks that you have deceived them with an ad, so they will go to the FTC and file a complaint. The FTC can just give a consent order, basically say, yeah, it looks like they're misleading people, and they'll issue a consent order if they think that. And if the company just then stops, they don't have to admit guilt, but they have to stop showing that ad, and everything's done. If that doesn't work, if the consent order doesn't work out, then it can go into an administrative complaint. There'll be a proceeding with an administrative judge who's part of the FTC, and both sides will submit evidence, the side that's complaining and the company that ran the ad. And if they find that, yes, it's still deceiving, we think it's deceiving, they'll get a cease and desist order, which is similar to other criminal court and types of situations. If that doesn't work, it could go to the full commission of the FTC for an appeal, and then it could go to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Then it goes into the legal system from the full commission of the FTC. It would go into the U.S. Court of Appeals. If that doesn't work, they could even take it as far as the Supreme Court if the company wanted to appeal the decision. So this does happen. And for example, here's one in 2015. Palm Wonderful had a lot of claims where they were trying to say that it prevented heart disease and a lot of other things that the courts felt were not adequately substantiated with evidence. Now it's interesting because Palm had actually funded a lot of studies by UCLA and a couple other institutions to try to prove that pomegranate juice was healthy for people and helped to prevent certain types of diseases and things. So even though they had some evidence, the courts felt that they didn't have enough evidence to prove it, and they told them that they could no longer do this. If you'd like to see other examples of this, you can go to these links. It can be pretty interesting to read about these. I know that a lot of people bring up, hey, I heard that Red Bull got sued because they don't really give you wings. That's absolutely not true. They may have been sued for that, but the courts would never uphold that because a typical person would not believe that product like that would give you wings. What they were sued for, and it was actually in a European court, I believe, was that they claimed that it would give you energy beyond what caffeine gave you, and they were unable to prove that element of their advertising claims. So that's the only thing that really was seen to be deceptive. It was not that they believed that consumers thought it would give you wings. So the FTC process, this could also go through the courts. The court system can also stop unfair and deceptive practices. And very rarely will they ask for corrective advertising. If they think that a lot of consumers were deceived, they'll ask them to actually run ads and say, hey, that ad that we had before wasn't entirely true. Here's what the true thing is. Regulations apply to the entire industry. So if they tell pomegranate, Palm Wonderful to stop making these claims, then another pomegranate juice company also couldn't make those claims. And quite often they'll issue rulings for an entire industry, but some examples of these types of things are at this link here if you want to see some more examples. Now, not all of the regulation in the advertising industry is through the government. Some of it is self-regulation, and it's better to self-regulate because it costs less, it goes faster, it's not as public, it doesn't get as much publicity, and you can get through it a lot more quickly. So self-regulation happens through the Council of the Better Business Bureau, or the CBBB. They have the National Advertising Division, the Advertising Self-Regulatory Council, and a Children's Advertising Review Unit. These are not governmental agencies, they're industry agencies that have people from the advertising industry and sometimes from the client side as well on these boards. So the NAD can receive a complaint similar to how the FTC would receive a complaint, and then they would investigate the validity. They would issue a ruling, and most companies, 95% of companies, will abide by the ruling, again, because they don't want it to go into the courts. They don't want the publicity. But the rulings about 50% to 60% of ads, they do find that they're not fully substantiated. Now, a lot of these might be on smaller brands that you never even heard of, but there are the ones, the 250 cases a year, about half of those are found to be not substantiated. So if the National Advertising Division's ruling is appealed, it can go to the Advertising Self-Regulatory Council, and this is where advertising professionals and other people from industry would be on this board, and they would issue a consent order, kind of like the FTC does. And most of the time, people will follow that. Only 4 times did it move from this to the FTC when it went through this process in the last 25 years. So usually this process will work. And again, it's self-regulatory, but it helps to avoid going through the courts. Now, there's another part of the Better Business Bureau's advertising unit. It's called the Children's Advertising Review Unit. Now, in this case, instead of waiting for a complaint before it ever goes on the air, before the radio ad or the TV ad, or in this case, or these days also video ads that would be streaming, they would submit the ad to this Children's Advertising Review Unit. And so they'll review any ads that are targeted to anybody 12 years old and younger. It's because 12-year-olds don't have the full reasoning power, and they sometimes might get deceived a lot more easily, so it pre-screens the ads. It'll pre-screen them and say, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not, or here's the changes you need to make it okay. So in this case, it actually is reviewed before the ad is put on television, versus the others are only reviewed if somebody complains about it. So the Children's Advertising Review Board guidelines, basically, they just don't want you to create an unreasonable expectation for the toy. If it's a wooden airplane, then you can't show it flying around the room if it doesn't have batteries and it doesn't actually fly around the room. They shouldn't blur between fantasy and reality. It should only show the items that come with it. If it's Barbie's dream house and there's no car, then don't show a car with Barbie's dream house. If it requires adult supervision, then we want to be sure that they show an adult in the ad as well. And of course, it should be appropriate for children. So the question is, where do you draw the line? What products would you prefer not to market or refuse to market? What marketing activities do you think are ethical or not ethical? And if it's legal, is it also ethical? Not always. So ask yourself those questions, understand what the laws are, and also understand what your ethical guidelines for yourself are, and understand what your company's ethical guidelines are. Get involved in setting the ethical guidelines for your company so you can feel proud to work for the company and for the brand that you do work for. All right, that is chapter 14. I look forward to seeing you in class.